Welcome back for part two of restoring this old 1968 Poulan Super 31 chainsaw. And we're going to start by rebuilding the carburetor. If you caught part one, that's where we took everything apart and frankly was more of a learning exercise about how these things are put together, where to get parts, etc. So I'm past that, and now I have parts coming in. I've got a new rebuild kit. This carburetor is a Tilliston, and it's a model HL88, and so the rebuild kit is a RK88HL, and apparently all the HL models are so similar that you can use the same rebuild kit on a lot of those. So these are the parts from the older parts that came out of the carburetor, and some of those I'm going to reuse. Most of them I'm not. In the middle here is all the new that came in the new kit. Just wanted to make sure I've got tit for tat. They're in order in how we're going to put this together. And then, of course, this is our cleaned carburetor parts at the bottom. We're not going to do anything with this reed valve manifold here. It's just there to look at. But starting with the first part is we're going to put in the needle and seat, which are these two pieces here. And interestingly, this is a full metal seat, whereas this one, if you remember, has a rubber insert in it. So I noticed that. I've got a new lever, and then this is a gasket. It's a little copper gasket, so we got a new one of those, so that's good. We're going to reuse our pivot arm thing there, and we're going to reuse that spring. That's pretty important. And then we've got a new main diaphragm gasket. Diaphragm goes on top of that. Then we've got our I forgot what they call that, regulator plate goes on top of this. And then we've got our pump gasket for the fuel pump. That's the fuel pump diaphragm. And this is the outer case of the fuel pump. And then this is a cork ring to seal it. I've heard people say that they don't like the way the cork rings seal, and they upgrade those with a rubber ring. But I'm just going to try it. We're going to do a pressure test and make sure it holds. And then finally, this is the cap that goes on the end. The one thing I don't have, though, is this was the screen that came out of it. And it was a lot filthier and plugged than it looks here, but I accidentally tore it taking it out. They're pretty fragile, so I have some replacements coming in for that. So, but that'll be the last part to put on this, and that's not a big deal. So let's go ahead and get started by putting our new needle and seat in the body. As I recall, this was pretty tight. Oh, you know what? This is not right. That ought to be, should be able to push down on that, so something's wrong here. So, interestingly, I went ahead and took the new needle and seat back out and put it together side by side with the old one. And I don't know if it's really obvious here, but there's definitely a difference in height on these two, and so I think that's probably what was causing the difference there. So I'm gonna put the old needle and seat back in. I checked it a little bit as best I could to make sure it does seal and that the little rubber insert on the inside is not hardened and brittle, etc. So I don't want to do it that way, but I think I don't have a choice unless I want to get a whole new kit. Okay, so this is the old needle and seat. I went ahead and used the same lever arm too, just to keep all of that the same in case there's any other differences. And I can tell already that this is back to normal. You know, you push down on the lever there and it opens up the needle. So I'm going to go with this for now. As I recall, this was pretty tight. So the rest of this is just putting it all together in sequence. And there you go. That's put back together. Like I said, we are going to wait for our screen. Got that coming in. This is a cork gasket that's going to go on top of that screen. And I already put that in place and put this cap on there. And I did a little bit of a old school pressure test with my mouth and tongue, and it's holding pressure, which is a good sign. That means our needle and seat's holding pretty good. I will do an actual pressure test later that you're going to see. I don't have my pressure tester with me, but I will have it. The other thing that I did was, this is the plate for the air filter, which is this thing that goes on it. And the carburetor kit did not come with a gasket for the mating between this air filter plate here and the carburetor. That's not a big deal. What I did is I took the old, this is not it, this is the new gasket that came with the kit, but the old gasket, I basically took that and I cut it out and I put a little tiny bit of RTV in there, and I made just a nice ring in there to seal that off. So that's all good. You know, the main things we need to talk about here is the flange that's going to go up against the reed manifold plate here. Okay. And I'm just going to use this gasket material that I have. This is plain old gasket material from AutoZone. This is, and this is where it gets important. We got to measure this stuff with our micrometer, and this is 1/32 of an inch thick, which is fine. It really doesn't matter how thick it is, but you know that's going to be on the side that goes to the engine. Okay, this gasket, which is between the carburetor and this reed plate manifold, is actually a little bit thinner. It should be, we're going to look, 1/64 of an inch thick. And we are going to have to make gaskets. Unfortunately, this is the cylinder, the head, and there's a little block plate here, little ring in the middle that goes between the block and the cylinder head, and this has a gasket on either side. Okay, now the thickness of the gasket that we have to put on this, I can't find gaskets for this. They don't make them anymore, so I'm going to have to make my own. But the thickness matters here. The reason is if I put a thick gasket on, it is going to cause the piston, when it rises up in the cylinder to top dead center, it's going to be lower than if I used a thin gasket, which means I'm going to lower my compression, which is going to be a loss of performance. At the same time, if it's too thin, it's going to come up too high in the cylinder and it's going to cause problems. Like it could even hit, believe it or not, it could even hit the, well, I'm just looking at this engine. I was going to say it could hit the spark plug, but the way this is oriented, that's not going to be possible. But it could go up too far in the engine. So, point is, you're supposed to have a squish clearance, and we're going to talk about this a lot later, but when the piston goes up inside the cylinder, the distance between the top of that piston and the cylinder head in here, when I say the head, I mean this top flat surface, is something like, I think 20 thousandths of an inch, between 20 and 40 thousandths of an inch. While we're waiting on our rings to come in, went ahead and did a squish test. And what that means is you're basically looking to make sure the piston is coming up into the head at just the right distance, and there's a gap between the top of this piston and the inside of this head, and you want to measure on the outer edges. And what you do is you take a piece of solder and you lay it across the piston. And here's a key: is you don't want to just do one side or the other, because a piston can rock. And if you put it on one side only, it can twist and it can give you a inaccurate reading. So you want it to go all the way across end to end so you get a good square push. And then you also want to make sure it's actually good to have it this way, as close to this way as you can, because the piston's most definitely going to rock this way. That's how it pivots on the wrist pin. But I did it in a couple of different directions, like this and like this. And just if you look at the top of the piston, there's a little bit of a notch, a little recess here for where the spark plug area is, up inside there. So you kind of want to avoid that. So you got to look in there and make sure you're getting a good solid contact. And then you basically, carefully put your head back on. I did mine without the gaskets just to see what I was getting. But you tighten it all down. You don't have to torque it, but just get it good and tight. And then you rotate it and you cram that piston up in there, and it'll squish this solder. And then you basically just take the solder out and you measure it. You can see this is flat. You can see in the middle it's still round. And so I measured that, both ends, and it's 90 thousandths. Which I was looking for it to be around 30 thousandths, according to what I've been told about this engine. So 90 thousandths is way off. That means the piston is sitting too low in the cylinder if 30 thousandths is the target. The other thing I did is I measured the thickness of this aluminum gasket ring thing here, and it was also coincidentally about 90 thousandths too. And so, I'm having to check to see if this was something that was necessary to add or if somebody raised it up in there on purpose, but that was what was on it. So still got to do a little bit of research on that, but I think I'm going to put it back together the way it was. I'm not going to risk removing this and then, causing a problem later. So But that is what you do for a squish test. I'm probably got some misinformation. It's probably not 30 thousandths is the target. It's probably, closer to 90, 80, something like that. But that is how you do it. It's good information to know. As far as this metal plate that went on here, that's in the middle. It's sandwiched between two very thin gaskets that were on it. And I had to make these gaskets on either side because you just can't find them and order them. At least I couldn't source one. So I used 1/64 inch thick gasket material, which is very, very thin, just almost paper thin. And I clamped down the aluminum plate on top of a piece of this and then took a box cutter. You can use a razor blade, sharp knife, etc. And I cut out the inside very carefully, and then I used a punch. This is a hole punch. You can buy a set of these pretty cheap, but it's got a sharp tip on it, and you pretty much just put it right over the hole and bang on it a few times with a hammer. You need a hard surface underneath it, but it cuts a pretty clean hole there. Then took a little bit of RTV, very, very thin layer, and smeared it on both surfaces, put them down on it, and pressed it down with some weight on top of it, two flat surfaces. So in the end, I've got a pretty good replacement set of gaskets here that's going to go on here when we put these put the rings and put the head back on. Okay, our screen came in that goes here. What we were waiting on that because I tore the old one. So basically, it goes in first, and these are very fragile, which is why I got two of them. But that goes in, and then this cork seal goes on top of that. Some people don't like to use the cork seal, and they can replace those with a rubber one, but I'm going to go ahead and use the cork seal anyway, and then we'll do a pressure test on it. And then let's see, this needs to go on the opposite side. The little nipple there. Opposite side of where the hookups are for the throttle. Other thing we needed to do is, not going to bore these out or anything. They don't need it, but I did manually hone them a little bit with sandpaper. This is a 320 grit, and what you basically do is you kind of gently, in a circular motion, but cutting down at an angle, just a couple of passes over, and then going back the opposite direction, and you can get this real nice, if you can see it there, crosshatch going on, just enough to knock the glaze off. And then I'm going to take transmission fluid and clean this out. Wipe it down real good this way. And then I'm going to take some cleaner towels, and I'm just going to keep wiping this out until it comes out clean. That should get any sanding debris or anything like that out of there. This is pretty standard procedure for these things. Got our piston rings in. Here they are. These are from Caber. I had to order them based on the measurements I took of the piston, both the diameter of the piston, which was 52 millimeters, and then the thickness of the rings, which I took from the old ones, which was 1.5 millimeters. So I ordered these, and So before we put these on, though, we're going to put them, one of them anyway, we're going to put it in the cylinder itself, and we're going to just measure the ring gap to make sure that that's going to look okay. Well, fuck. And it's not. Damn it. Well, we ran into a problem, so these rings are not going to work. And the reason is these have what's called an outer or a side notch. The ones I need are an inner notch. So this is what these look like up close. And they're designed where that long edge goes underneath the indexing pin if it's sticking out where the post is pointing out to the outer edge of the piston. These are oriented differently, where what I need is what's called an inner notch, and it looks like this. Okay. The other thing is, to properly measure the ring itself, just to see if I at least got that right. You press your ring in there, and then you slide it down and push it up in there with the piston to square it evenly in the cylinder, and then you measure that ring gap. And that ring gap, I don't even have to measure it. I can just tell by looking at it. You can even see it. It's way too big. It should only be like a, very small gap. I'm not even going to measure it because I can tell that's almost an eighth of an inch just looking at it with my eyes. So that tells me that this ring is too small anyway. So what I'm going to have to do, I've already checked into this, I'm going to have to get 54 millimeter. This was the 52 millimeter piston. I'm going to have to get a 54 millimeter ring, and I'm going to have to basically grind it back, file it back, and recreate the notches on it so that they're the kind of notches that I want. While we're waiting on those piston rings, we're going to go ahead and put the fuel filter and internal fuel line back in place. This is the fitting that goes inside it. On these older ones, it's actually a screw fitting that goes in. The newer ones, and I say newer, like, I don't know, like something 75 and beyond or whatever. Sometimes they have two fittings that go into the tank, and they're sealed by a little, either a rubber grommet or no rubber grommet, and you have to pull the lines through. But this one does have a fitting, and you can kind of see, got to go over that nipple. This is Tygon line. I've got a couple of different sizes of Tygon line. I got this filter. I think this is pretty good. This was the old one that came out of it, and honestly, I lost the little tip that came with this, which I think was a little basket screen, and the inside of it looked like it had some kind of sawdust or maybe steel wool, some kind of thing like that, but it all happened so fast that I lost the tip of this, so may put this back on later, but this is the original one. It's heavy, so that's good because, you want it to hang down on the bottom of the tank. This also has some weight in it, so these new filters, they have a weight on the inside, and the idea is that when you're turning your saw and you're cutting, this is kind of hanging down on the bottom of the tank. So the length of this line is important. So you want it to go into this back corner of the tank as far as it can, so that when you put this fitting in, it'll all fit. It fit pretty tight on the end of this nipple, but to get it onto this one, it is not going to go on here unless I have a heat gun or I heat it up. All right, so I had to go old school with a little candle and heated up the end of this Tygon, but got her on there. Feels pretty good. Thing is, with these old nipples, the nipples are so huge, but the inside diameter of the actual flow is so much smaller. It's very hard to modify this stuff, but we got it on there, so that's all good. Now we're just going to push this down in here where it needs to go. Make sure it's at the back of that tank. And then we're going to screw this in. Now we're going to put the bigger line onto the carburetor, and kind of the same thing is, like I said, I don't have my heat gun with me, or I would be using that. So I'm going old school here, and I'm heating this up with a little bit of a flame. And on this case, I'm going to squeeze this right onto the end of this nipple. I did put 2-stroke oil on that nipple, and that thing went on solid. So that's good. Put that on the carburetor first. Then when you put the carburetor on, it's much easier to put it onto the nipple after that. Now we're going to go ahead and put the intake manifold on. We did have to make our own custom gasket. Can't find these, couldn't source them, so I just made this one. This is out of 1/32 gasket material, pretty easy to make. One thing I want to be careful about, see this little hole? That's the pulse line, so you don't want to block that in any way. But it does need to go on the bottom, because carburetor, when we mount the carburetor up to it, look at that little hole. That has to match up against it, and you don't want to block that, or guess what? Your fuel pump is not going to work. So now we're going to, oh, we also have this new gasket. Came in our kit. So we're going to put that on. I got it in there. 2 fingers. How about that? That one went on. I don't know if you can see that. I'll hold it up here where you can, but right in here, you got to be able to put it on. There's a little bit of a feel for it. And this back one in here is going to be even harder. Well, this one's a little bit of trouble, and so to, this bolt went in pretty easy, but this one is kind of back in there a little complicated. So I've left it kind of loose where I can lift this up, and I'm going to have to put this nut back in there. I need 2 hands to do it here. Well, that wasn't too bad. I had it fall off at first, and I had to fish it out, but now it's gone on there, so I'm just running it down with my fingers as far as I can, and then we're going to get the wrench after it on both sides here. That should take care of that. Patience, brothers, patience. A little challenging getting a big old thick wrench like this in here. Probably better to have a real thin profile wrench. I don't have those, but a little patience, got it all done. That's all tight. I feel pretty good about that. So now we're going to connect our carburetor intake to our fuel tank. And notice that our oil is also kind of in that same area, so just want to be mindful of that. But I'm just going to cut this at about right here, and I can already tell because of the diameter there, I do not think that this is going to go on here very well. We're going to give it a try here. If it doesn't go on, we're going to have to heat it up like we have been doing and soften it so that it'll slip on the nipple, which is what I'm going to have to do. So that worked good. We're going to do the same thing on this nipple right here. Just going to heat it up. I already got a little bit of 2-stroke oil on it. Slip that right onto that nipple like that. And we're going to run this a little differently than the way it was run originally. I might put a zip tie on that there. Kind of went on pretty slippery. But instead of this kind of going back over where the throttle was kind of touching that, I think I'm just going to leave it loose, and I'm going to come up over the top of the carburetor. I went ahead and put a zip tie on that here. I didn't like it, how loose that fit, so that's all good and snug.